have a bit of time. So I'm going to do my pre-reading, uh, core reading. Sorry, this is stuff I'm supposed to read before today's lecture. I'm going to do it now. There are 8 pages, so I think that's possible. So today's lecture, I think it's on contextualization. That's at least the heading of this book: contextualization and enculturation. Zoom in slightly. Okay, all right. So here it goes. We come now to the third area of concern in contextualization, that of relating the gospel to culture. In the previous chapter, we noted the general failure of Western Christianity to take the indigenous cultures of the younger churches in the two-thirds world seriously, at least until very recently. One reason why this was the Enlightenment concept of progress, which gave rise to the ethnocentrism of the Western world. This, however, is not the Church's historical position towards cultures. Lamin Sanneh, amongst others, has shown that the Gentile breakthrough in Christian mission in the apostolic period was made possible only because Paul and others fought for the translation of the gospel into Hellenistic culture on the basis of the universality of the gospel. This meant that the church at its very beginnings was committed to cultural pluralism as a fundamental missionary paradigm. Unfortunately, in subsequent centuries, the church often lost sight of this ideal. A second reason for the failure to take culture seriously is a result of the individualization of the concept of salvation. Unlike the first few centuries, when the emphasis was on the evangelization of communities, increasingly, and especially in the modern period, the focus was on the salvation of individuals. Hence, the concern for culture was gradually lost. During the modern period, probably the earliest and most notable reactions to ethnocentric and individual centered model of missionary work were the efforts in the 16th and 17th centuries of Matteo Ricci and Robert de Nobili in China and India, respectively. But it is probably true to say that the universal awareness of this as a problem is a post World War II phenomenon, which came in the wake of the decline of colonialism and a worldwide resurgence of indigenous cultural and religious consciousness. The term enculturation, which is increasingly being used to describe this concern, is of Roman Catholic origins. Arbuckle notes that Catholic theologians were not entirely happy with contextualization as a term to denote the process of relating the gospel to culture. Among other reasons, they felt that, like the earlier terms, accommodation and adaptation, it tended to emphasize external contacts between the gospel and local culture. Tracing the winds of change since Vatican II, Arbuckle notes that from the 1970s onwards, enculturation became the preferred term. This is defined in the papal encyclical Redemptoris Missio as the intimate transformation of authentic cultural values through their integration in Christianity and the insertion of Christianity in the various human cultures. Thus, instead of merely external relationship between the gospel and culture, conceived in terms of kernel and husk, it urges instead a dynamic ongoing process of reciprocal and critical interaction and assimilation between them. Or, as Bosch describes it, enculturation suggests a double movement. There is at once enculturation of Christianity and Christianization of culture. The question of how enculturation should be carried out has been discussed in some detail elsewhere. But for enculturation to be possible, we must have some clear ideas of the characteristics of the local cultures under consideration. For the rest of this section, I will attempt to give a brief outline of some of the more important features of Asian cultures, and where possible, indicate how indigenous Asian theologies must come to terms with them. The discussion will be restricted to Asia from India eastward. Obviously, it is impossible to generalize for so diverse a region. Certain general characteristics may be discerned, but it is better to view these as relative tendencies rather than in absolute terms as if they are distinctively Asian characteristics. Moreover, important diversities also exist. I will begin with Asian worldviews. Worldviews. In the last chapter, we noted that due to the influence of Platonic and Cartesian thought, there is a strong tendency towards dualism in Western thought. Admittedly, there are also differences in Asian worldviews. The Indian worldview, with its strong Hindu background, at the more philosophical level, tends to be dualistic also. Nevertheless, the dualism is not necessarily carried over into the folk religious level. We noted earlier in this chapter that Asian worldviews in general, including that of India, possess an excluded middle component wherein the spiritual and the physical worlds are seen to interact actively. This effectively fuses the different components of the worldviews into an integrated whole. This contrasts sharply with the more dualistic Western view shaped by the Enlightenment, which tends to dichotomize the spiritual and the physical. In this sense, Asian worldviews are more holistic than the Western one. Furthermore, in some Asian cultures, the worldviews are holistic in an even more fundamental sense. For example, Tu Wei Ming points out that the Chinese see the world as a psychophysical structure in the Jungian sense, which cannot be differentiated simply into the Cartesian categories of spirit and matter. It is not the Chinese thinkers that Chinese thinkers did not clearly distinguish between the two. Rather, in Chinese metaphysics, the most basic stuff of the cosmos is neither mere spirit nor matter, but qi, which can be rendered matter energy or vital force. He goes on to note that the continuous presence in Chinese philosophy of the idea of qi as a way of conceptualizing the basic structure and function of the cosmos, despite the availability of symbolic resources to make an analytical distinction between spirit and matter, signifies a conscious refusal to abandon a mode of thought that synthesizes spirit and matter as an undifferentiated whole. To say that the cosmos is a continuum and that all of its components are internally connected is also to say that it is an organismic unity. It is an organismic unity, holistically integrated at each level of complexity. The fact that Asian worldviews tend to be holistic rather than dualistic has important consequences for the communication of the gospel in Asia. This may be illustrated by China's response to the gospel in the 20th century. Despite China's strong xenophobia and history of persistent rejection of Christianity, the gradual collapse of the old China in the 19th century and the loss of confidence in the ancient traditions led to a great openness to the gospel at the beginning of the 20th century. Then, in the 1920s, a strong anti Christian reaction set in among the intellectuals, which stifled the growth of the church once more. The question that must be asked is, why was it that in the first period of history, when China set aside her xenophobia and opened her doors wide to Western influences, Christianity was rejected by the intelligentsia? There were already a number of historical and cultural reasons which had predisposed the Chinese against Christianity. Admittedly, the existing evidences do not as yet allow us to draw final conclusions. Nevertheless, it is here suggested that one of the key reasons appears to be that the gospel was presented in dualistic terms to a culture that invariably thought and functioned holistically. China was looking for deliverance from colonial oppression by Western powers in Japan and from its economic and industrial backwardness. The conservatives presented a gospel which promised salvation for the soul, but not for the body or the nation. The Chinese intellectual leadership rejected that as mere superstition and irrelevant to their struggle for national salvation. On the other hand, the modernists did bring a gospel of social salvation, which included modern education, technology, and medicine. Why did China not accept this version of Christianity? The answer probably is partly to be found in a failure of liberal Christianity, which is secularized with its secularized worldview to take seriously the spiritual dimension in this Chinese worldview. Nor could it, with its Pelagian leanings, provide a distinctive answer to the moral quest of the Chinese mind for a spiritual renewal in the individual, without which national reconstruction could not occur. Thus, both the conservatives and the liberals sought to present the message of Christ, but each presented half the gospel at best. The result was that both truncated versions of the gospel were rejected because the felt needs of a holistic culture were not properly met. Ways of thinking. The second aspect of Asian cultures that we will look at is the ways of thinking. It is now generally accepted that every culture has its own manner of thinking, which may be very different from another's. Edmund Perry, building on the work of F.S.C. Northrop and F.H. Smith, in a lecture at the University of Manchester, May 2nd, 1950, draws attention to the three basic cognitive approaches that are found in different cultures. Smith differentiates between the conceptual, corresponding to Northrop's cognition by postulation, the psychical, corresponding to Northrop's cognition by intuition, and the concrete relational, in which life and reality are seen pictorially in terms of active emotional relationships present in a concrete situation. The West, India, and China respectively represent the preponderance of these three ways of knowing. On the basis of the above, he proposes with slight modifications the three models for the Western, Chinese, and Indian minds, as illustrated in Figure 1. In each model, the primary mode of cognition is represented by the innermost circle, with the others being secondary and tertiary. The different primary modes of cognition can be illustrated by the different approaches taken by each culture towards, say, the question of veracity of reported miracles. With respect to the first, the Western mind focuses on critical conceptual and analytical issues like how can miracles be possible in a scientific age? The Chinese mind is likely to ask, can I trust the person who reportedly witnessed and told me of the miracle? Thus, focusing on the relationship between the teller and the listener. The Indian mind is likely to say, I will accept its truthfulness if I can experience it for myself. Of course, these are matters of relative emphases within each culture, but they do end up shaping the predominant theological questions asked and approaches taken from within each culture differently. Okay. Closely related to this is the matter of patterns of logic. On the basis of an analysis of logical patterns in linguistic structures, Robert B. Kaplan has suggested that the patterns of logic in English, or Anglo American, Semitic, Middle Eastern, and Oriental cultures can be represented by the diagrams in Figure 2. The above analysis finds confirmation in Hajime Nakamura's of ways of thinking of Eastern people, sorry, with minor modifications. Kaplan's designation of Oriental would presumably apply only to East Asians like Chinese and Japanese, who, though not irrational, are less concerned with logical exactitude than with human relationships. However, the characterization of the Indian way of cognition as being primarily based on psychical experience will need some qualification. Nakamura argues that Indian thought cannot be simply labeled intuitive because some of the literature employs very intricate logical arguments, such as the Buddhist Abhidharmas. Moreover, Indian grammar demonstrates very advanced developments of analytical thought. In our efforts to communicate the gospel cross culturally in Asia, we must take seriously the differing ways of thinking. For example, giving the penchant for concrete relational thinking and a preference for nonlinear logic among Chinese, Japanese, and other East Asians for the purpose of expressing the Christian faith in these contexts, much more emphasis ought to be given to stories, parables, pictures, narratives, poetry, songs, and the like. Instead of rational apologetics, systematic theologies built upon inductive and deductive logic and cold analytical approaches to biblical studies. On the other hand, rational apologetics will seem to be necessary among some Indians whose Hindu or Buddhist backgrounds have already familiarized them with analytical logic. Family and group solidarity. Family and group solidarity is one trait that characterizes almost all Asian cultures, with hardly any exceptions, other than that of modern, Western educated, and secularized individuals. For example, the centrality of the family in traditional Chinese society is well known. The family is not only the primary social group, but it is also the prototype of all social organizations. Generally, families in traditional Asia are complex rather than nuclear. They're usually one of three types: stem, joint, or polygamous. It is common for kinship to extend beyond the complex family through cousin marriages, thus creating a whole interlocking network of wider family relationships within a village or indeed a larger geographical area. Within such societies, the question of the place of the individual relative to the group is not always easily defined. For example, in Japanese society, there appears to be some ambiguity. Nakamura argues that social ties in Japan take precedence over the individual, but Moore notes that there are also clear evidences to the contrary. In Chinese society, the relationship is somewhat clearer. Confucian ethics treats the individual and the family as both equally important and mutually dependent. Thus, on the one hand, the individual achieves his inner stature as well as his social status through his participation in the social process and his contribution to society, and the family is the point at which to begin. Yet, on the other hand, should conflict arise between the individual and the community, of which the family is a microcosm, the individual can exercise his right of conscience. The emphasis on family and group solidarity in Asian cultures has clear implications for contextualization. We will look briefly at three examples. The first concerns how evangelism and church planting is done. Traditional Western style evangelism presupposes the priority of the individual over the group. For example, the Western model of youth evangelism is based on a cultural model in which youths are given a fair degree of freedom to make their own choices, including their religion. But this is rarely obtained, even in modern, secularized, and cosmopolitan Asian cities. Does not the cultural emphasis on families and groups, and usually patriarchal ones at that, require Asian Christians to focus instead on evangelistic methods that are more family and group orientated and adult centered, beginning with the heads of families or communities? There are clear evidences that these are usually more fruitful than approaches that presuppose a Western individualism. A second example concerns ethics. Christian moral thinking formulated in the West invariably prioritizes principles over relationships. But how do Christian ethics operate in a culture where the order is reversed? For example, family ties are so close in many Asian societies that nepotism invariably results. Yet, if a Christian fails to take care of family members, he or she is also damned in the eyes of his or her culture. Or again, where is the dividing line to be drawn between a bribe and a gift, given appreciation and to cement a relationship? There is obviously a need for the development of more culturally sensitive ethics. The third example concerns pastoral practice. For example, theological discussions on pedobaptism invariably centers on biblical, historical, and theological questions. But could the real issue be the cultural one of how God's covenant with us is worked out in different cultures? Some presupposing individual decisions and others family and group decisions. Guilt and or shame consciousness. We come fourthly to the question of guilt and shame, which has often been a source of real frustration to Western missionaries. Ruth Benedict had earlier characterized all cultures as either shame or guilt cultures, which are distinguished as follows. True shame cultures rely on external sanctions for good behavior, not, as true guilt cultures do, on an internalized conviction of sin. Shame is a reaction to other people's criticism. It requires an audience, or at least a man's fantasy of an audience. Guilt does not. In a nation where honor means living up to one's own picture of oneself, a man may suffer from guilt, though no other man knows of his misdeeds, and a man's feeling of guilt may actually be relieved by confessing his sin. However, it must be asked whether such distinction can be absolute or should they rather be seen as relative tendencies, since the evidence seems to indicate that most, if not all, cultures have the concepts of both guilt and shame, however limited. For example, Kosaka Masaki quotes Ruth Benedict as suggesting that the Japanese not only has a shame culture, but lacks conscience and guilt consciousness. However, he goes on to note that this is too sweeping a generalization. He argues that the advent of Buddhism has introduced the concept of guilt into Japan. Nevertheless, Nakamura suggests that modern day Japanese are noticeably lacking in sin consciousness in a religious sense, a fact that is tied up with their this worldly view of life. At the same time, they are very shame conscious in its practical and moral sense because conformity to the mores of their particular social nexus is a cultural necessity. Chinese culture, with its strong emphasis on the importance of li, or rules of propriety, which covers all aspects of life, personal, social, and religious, obviously possesses a strong sense of shame consciousness. Again, it has been suggested that sin consciousness is almost universally lacking. J. Dyer Ball, writing in the Hastings Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics, has suggested that the task of tasks is to bring home to the native Chinese mind the sense of what sin is. But is this an adequate interpretation, not just of Chinese culture in particular, but of Asian cultures in general, which are largely shame oriented? Wayne Dye suggests an alternative way of looking at the problem. He argues that the cultural anthropological and modern psychological studies, together with the teaching of the Bible, Romans 2:15 to 16, combine to point to the universality of the moral conscience and the concept of guilt in all cultures. He further argues that the anthropological distinction between guilt and shame cultures is not aimed so much at denying the reality of guilt as at emphasizing the important place of social sanctions in regulating behavior in some cultures. Whether they're from a guilt or shame culture, people are aware of wrongdoing, though they may not call it sin, and they try to justify themselves and or to find some sort of atonement. Thus, the problems that Western missionaries have had in trying to instill a sense of sin into indigenous believers may in fact arise from the efforts of the former in trying to impose a universal definition of sin, which is in reality a Western cultural interpretation upon the latter. What Dye says addresses directly the key issue in contextualization within shame cultures. The question that concerns us is how we can help those from shame cultures to come to a clear understanding and conviction of sin in the Christian sense. This is important because the meaning of sin is not properly communicated. What is heard is the call to repentance in Christ is the turning from shameful things instead of sinful things, which can be quite different. Suggests some steps which are Dye suggests some steps which are crucial to this process. First, we must avoid imposing a Western enculturated ethics upon another culture, and to demand surface changes which may be quite unnecessary. Second, we will need to carefully analyze the culture in which we are working so that we can get below the surface to the underlying moral values and meanings. Third, we should begin speaking about repentance in those areas in which the Holy Spirit is already convicting in the culture and makes sins. Fourth, we should urge Christians in non Western cultures to read the Bible for themselves from within their own cultures and to trust the Holy Spirit to lead them to develop a Christian ethic for their own cultures. Careful attention to these will make it easier for those in shame cultures to understand the gospel in its totality. Concepts of authority and leadership patterns. Self government is a precondition for the development of a truly indigenous church. But for self government to be effective and Christian at the same time, the patterns of church leadership adopted must be developed in proper tension between gospel and culture. For that to be possible, to be certain, Asian Asian cultural concepts of authority and leadership need to be taken into account. We will examine two of these below. The first is that In contrast to Western leadership models, which are largely institutional and democratic in nature, Asian concepts of power are usually much more personalized, paternalistic, and authoritarian. Lucian W. Pai argues that in general, Asian cultures link authority to virtue, whether associated with Confucian scholarship, as in the case of China, or religious performances, as in some parts of Southeast Asia. The consequence of this is a pattern of authority, which is highly personalized rather than institutionalized in constitutionally defined offices. Further, the importance of group association and loyalty in Asia leads to a highly paternalistic leadership style. Pai also notes that in Asia, primitive power, that is, the crude, brutal use of force to intimidate, which is associated with a breakdown of law and order in society, is generally seen as an ever lurking danger. Any relaxation of authority is perceived as dangerous, and therefore authoritarianism is much more readily accepted than in the West. There are regional variations in the modes of paternalism, of course. In Confucian cultural areas of Asia, it is modeled upon the concept of filial piety, with leaders and followers cast in the molds of benevolent fathers and dutiful children, respectively. In Southeast Asian cultures, it tends to be built upon symbiotic patron client relationships wherein leaders and followers manipulate each other in their quest for authority and security. In India, it is built upon the Hindu caste system, which allows leaders to function in the basis of a different set of rules from that of the ordinary people, and which at the same time mandates subservience for the lower castes on the theological grounds that the requirements of their dharma must be fulfilled. Whatever the differences, the net result is that despite the impact on modernity, authoritarian paternalism together with psychology of dependency remains powerful forces in Asian cultures today. A second aspect that concerns us is the type of persons in whom authority resides. It is a well known fact that in China, moral authority and power is vested with the scholar gentleman. And as in every traditional Asian culture, this is further buttressed by age. In India, spiritual authority is vested in the guru, who may be a monk who has joined an order, or he may be a sannyasin, the wandering holy man who adopts a life of renunciation. This is often associated with the fourth and final stage of life in classical Hinduism, the earlier stages being first, spiritual training and education in the Hindu scriptures, second, marriage and establishment of a family lineage, and third, life as a forest hermit. Thus, in both cases, moral and of or spiritual authority is perceived to lie with those who have undergone education, extensive self-cultivation, whether spiritual, moral, or both, and advancement in years. How are these cultural characteristics to impact our thinking on church leadership patterns in Asia? Most Asian churches have borrowed heavily from Western models of church leadership. This includes a strong democratic element, which is characterized by open debates, a less authoritarian and paternalistic style, and a willingness to allow younger people to take leadership. What Pai says of Asian societies at large applies equally within the Asian churches. Distaste for open criticism of authority, fear of upsetting the unity of the community, and knowledge that any violation of the community's rules of propriety will lead to ostracism, all combine to limit the appeal of Western democracy. Further, it is arguable that the influence of the Western seminary approach to training has led to an overemphasis on the academic preparation of Asian church leadership at the expense of the moral and spiritual. If Asian theology is to be truly contextual, it must help the churches to rethink their authority patterns and ways of choosing and training leaders. In particular, it must focus on the question of how Asian cultural characteristics, on the one hand, and the biblical emphases of spiritual and moral maturity and knowledge of Christian truths, on the other, can be brought into creative tension with each other to produce the desired kind of leader for the Asian church. Understanding of history. The Christian view of history is founded on three convictions: that God acts in it, that he guides it in an unilinear direction, and that he will bring it finally to its intended goal. This is rather different from Asian views of history, both Indian and Chinese. Both the latter two views of history has been described as cyclical, but not in the same sense. David Bebbington notes that Indian thought conceives the universe of going through cycles of Mahaguya of enormous proportions. Each Mahayuga is said to be 12,000 years or sometimes more. It consists of four yugas or ages, each of which is preceded by dawn and followed by twilight. The point is that human life is caught in endless cycles and that human activity is in the final analysis futile because what has been will always be. The view of history and of life is reinforced by the doctrines of karma and samsara as applied to the individual lives, which stresses the endless cycles of birth and rebirth from which all Hindus and Buddhists strive to escape. The consequences of this view of history are twofold. First, Indian histories, of which there are very few, are far from scientific in the modern sense. Rather, they are characterized by imprecision of dates and figures, colorful hyperboles, fantasy, and the like. More importantly, since this is a world of impermanence, human effort here and now is futile, and resignation becomes the prescription for life. As Bebbington says, cosmic cycles breed passivity. The Chinese view of history, on the other hand, is built on the concept of dynastic cycles. The central concept is that of the mandate of heaven being given to the first ruler of a dynasty as a reward for his virtue, and forfeited by the last because of moral failure. History was thus written to serve what Arnold Toynbee describes as utilitarian purpose. It provided a storehouse of precedents to guide current ethical and political practice. It has sometimes been suggested that the Chinese view of history, like that of the Indian, is inimical to the concept of progress inherent in the Christian view of history as unilinear. Tu Weiming, however, contests this. He argues that it is misleading to describe Chinese history as recording a number of related events happening in a regularly repeated order. Chinese historiography is not a reflection of cyclic worldview. The Chinese worldview is neither cyclic nor spiral, it is transformational. How is the gospel to impact Asian cultures given the very different views of history? Here it appears that the issue boils down to a clash of worldviews with respect to the Indian view of history, which we may grant that there are certain cyclical patterns in human existence. Christianity nevertheless affirms a teleology in history, which humanity can help fulfill. It is precisely at this point that the gospel challenges the Indian worldview and its concomitant passivity in this life. Similarly, in the case of the Chinese view of history, granted that it has a unitarian and transformational function, it remains focused on an idealized past antiquity rather than on the future. There is no clear eschatological goal towards which history is moving. This appears to be the key reason why China in the past has always tended to lock itself into an antiquated conservatism, from which it is only beginning to emerge in this century. It remains the task of Christian theology to show that the gospel can contribute towards the preservation of the deepest yearnings of ancient China's ancient traditions without allowing the culture to be entrapped by these in a manner that is inimical to progress at the same time. Asian cultures and modernity. We have come finally to the question of the impact of modernity on Asian cultures. Here, we will focus primarily on Japan, which is the obvious choice for a case study. Its surface adaptation to the modern world may have fueled theories, mainly Western, of the convergence of industrialized societies, leading to the disappearance of the cultural distinctiveness of Asian societies. If this is the likely scenario for the future, the obvious implication would be that we should not be too concerned with the question of enculturation because the latter presupposes the perpetuation of cultural distinctives, at least in the short term. A number of sociological studies have been done on Japan, and some of the results have been summarized in Joy Henry's essay, Japan, the Anthropology of Modernity. Compare also the bibliography therein. For our purpose, we'll look at the impact on modernity on the family and on religious beliefs to illustrate this point. The pre modern Japanese family structure is based on actual samurai practice and legally codified at the beginning of the Meiji period. Its chief characteristic is the household, the which was a continuing unit consisting of a single married couple in each generation remaining in the home. Thus, each unit may consist of two, three, or more generations living together, holding property and living and working together to uphold its reputation. All were regarded as temporary residents charged with putting the concerns of a unit above individual interests. Members of the were thus forever bound into relations of dependence and obligation to one another, either as members of the same house or for those who moved out in relations between houses. After the end of the Second World War, the as a legal entity was abolished in preference for the Western model of nuclear family. It was assumed that modernization would bring Japanese family structure in line with Western ones. However, Henry cites different studies showing that this has not been the case. At both the village and urban levels, the often remains the basic unit for social, political, and religious life. Furthermore, the structural principles of the are found to have penetrated relations between teachers and pupils, landlords and tenants, politicians and supporters, and even gangsters and accomplices. It also explains the close knit relationship between employers and employees in Japanese companies, which accounts for the caring benevolence of the former and the intense loyalty of the latter. Thus, despite the great changes in the social organization that have come about in the last 40 and more years, the basic social structure of the prevails in Japan at various levels of life. The same observation applies to the impact of modernization on religious faith. Many changes and adaptations to the religious practices of the Japanese people have occurred, leading to the syncretism of all sorts. Thus, typically, a supposedly irreligious Japanese may very likely have participated in Shinto shrines as a child, undergone a Shinto or Christian wedding, lived by Confucian or Christian morality, sought help from shamanistic type of healers, and attended Buddhist funeral services. But that has not resulted in a secularization of Japanese society, nor prevented them from retaining their cultural distinctives in religion. Indeed, H. Byron Earhart argues that it is a misconception to think that modernization has made Japan more westernized and less traditional. Rather, it appears that the distinctiveness of Japanese religion will persist into the future. Kami, Buddhas, ancestors, and holy persons will probably remain at the core of Japanese religion and continue to form a distinctive pattern or sacred way that has been always been characteristic of the Japanese religious heritage. The above conclusions are further confirmed by evidences elsewhere. For example, Lucian Pai, in his earlier mentioned study on political authority patterns in Asia, firmly rejects the notion that modernization will lead to a distinctive culture wherein all modern people shed their traditional ways to conform to a uniform personality. Instead, he argues that political structures will always have a strong parochial dimension because every political system is anchored in its distinctive history, and the central political values of loyalty and patriotism and phenomenon of national identity means that differences are certain to persist and possibly to increase with modernization. He concludes that modernization will produce political systems in Asia which will be even more varied than Western ones, and at the same time different from them because traditional values are not shed. Another example can be found in the resurgence of the pursuit of tribal, ethnic, national, and religious identity throughout the world today. It is clearly seen in the present tensions in the former Yugoslavia and USSR, or in many parts of Africa. On the religious scene, it is not just Islamic fundamentalism that is on the rise, but the resurgence of almost all traditional religions. Even in cosmopolitan Singapore, one of the most westernized of Asian societies, there is a resurgence of Chinese traditions following the government's call in the 1980s for a re emphasis on Confucian values to give a moral underpinning to Singapore society. Samuel Huntington probably sums it up well in his comment that de-Westernization and indigenization of elites is occurring in many non-Western countries at the same time that Western, usually American cultures, styles, and habits become more popular among the mass of people. It can therefore be concluded that while modernization will affect changes and mixing of cultural and religious elements in all sorts of permutations and combinations in Asian societies, the indications are that the distinctive cultural elements will persist into the future, at the very least for the next generation or two. That being so, the agenda for the inculturation of the gospel in Asia is one that the Asian churches cannot ignore without losing their missiological credibility. In the next chapter, we'll look at the justifications for the fourth and final criterion for a contextual and missiological theology, the issue of faithfulness to the Christian tradition. Done. That's the reading for today's lecture. Thanks for watching or listening. Goodbye. I will delete this very soon.